This portion of European history is called the Middle Ages. A lot of people call it medieval time, and medieval sounds like this very foreboding, dark kind of thing. It's the time of the castles and the knights and all that kind of stuff. But medieval doesn't really mean anything crazy. It just means the Middle Age. So you can see down here, the word medieval just means Middle Age. So as we had talked about before, Rome at the very end split into two empires, Eastern and Western Rome. And the eastern part of the Roman Empire became known as the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire grew very, very strong and rich, mostly through their trade efforts. They were able to trade with a lot of different countries and make a whole bunch of money. The leader of the Byzantine Empire at this time was Justinian. And Justinian was not only in charge of the government itself, but he was also in charge of the Christian church. Okay, and he was an autocrat. He did this all by himself. Okay, an autocrat means that you're a dictator that only works alone. You don't have anybody else making decisions. And the only help was he got some advice from his wife, and his wife's name was Theodora. And so she was kind of like a co-ruler, the closest advisor, but he made all of the final decisions. One of the things that he brought that is still used today is Justinian's Code. Justinian's Code, what he did is he took all of the Roman laws that had been written down and were so useful, and he put them all together into one single code. And really, it's still, even to this day, that Justinian's Code is used as kind of the basis of law in many countries. Still a part of the laws of a bunch of countries in throughout Europe especially. Now, the other thing that happened because of the Byzantine Empire was there was a new alphabet created. Okay, and what happened is there were two brothers, Cyril and Methodius. Okay, and Cyril and Methodius wanted to spread Christianity, and they wanted to teach Christianity to these people in Eastern Europe called the Slavs. Okay, and so that's not a typo, it's not slaves, it's the Slavs. The problem was these Slavic people couldn't read or understand the Latin that was around before. It didn't match up with the sounds that they made when they talked. It didn't match up with their writing, didn't match up with anything. And so Cyril and Methodius created this whole brand new alphabet called the Cyrillic alphabet. And the whole point of it was so that they could write Bibles out so that the people of Eastern Europe, the Slavs, could read and understand that Bible. And it's still to this day used in many countries in Eastern Europe, including Russia as one of the major ones. And so during this time, Christianity was also coming through a separation, but what was happening is there were leaders of Christianity, just like there is today, especially in the Catholic Church. There were these leaders, and they were called the Patriarchs of Christianity. And in the West, it was this guy known as the Pope that we still have today. The Pope still existed as the leader of Roman Catholicism. But in the western part of the Roman Empire, it was the Pope who was in charge of Christianity, and he was the Patriarch of Rome, and he claimed to be the leader of all the Christians. Now, of course, that's going to upset you if you're the leader in the East, the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and so you're the Patriarch of Constantinople, and you're thinking, why is this guy out in the West in this other town claiming to be the leader of all the Christians when I'm supposed to be the leader of half of them here? And so in 1054 AD, there was the Great Schism of 1054, and schism means like breaking apart. And so what happened is Christianity broke into two different chunks at this time. It broke into the Byzantine Christianity, which was Eastern Orthodox, and that still exists today, and then it also broke off into the Roman Catholic Church. You've heard of Catholics, and so that was the Western Roman part, and they kind of had different rules, and they worship a little bit differently. Obviously they have different leaders, but still to this day the Pope is the leader of Roman Catholicism, the Catholics. So as all great empires do, the Byzantine Empire also fell. And the way that the Byzantine Empire fell is most of their land, a whole lot of their land was conquered by Arabs. And these Arabs came from North Africa and Southwest Asia, and they were followers of a fairly new religion called Islam. Okay, and they came in and they took over these trade routes from Venice, and so this powerful North Italian city-state was in charge now of trade, and all of a sudden the Byzantines were not getting that anymore. So number one, they lost all their land to the Arabs. Number two, or a bunch of land. Number two, they were losing all their trade, all their money to Venice, this powerful North Italian city-state. Okay, and then third, when the Turks came in and took over, they changed things. They completely changed it up. They changed the capital from Constantinople was the name of the capital before, and they changed it to Istanbul. And when they changed it in about 1453, when the Ottoman Turks came and took over, when they changed that, they also made Istanbul like an Islamic cultural center. And so they introduced Islam to the empire, and it quickly grew and was taken in by many of the people in that area. However, the Byzantine Empire, the legacy still led to the cultures growing all across Europe. It led to this cultural flowering where Europe was able to move themselves closer to the Renaissance, closer to this time of brand new ideas. At the same time, Western Rome was being invaded by Germanic tribes, and the Germanic tribes came in and took over from the northern part of Rome, and they took over most of northern Rome, and they took this thing that used to be a huge empire and they split it up. In Spain, the Visigoths got that area. You can see right here in green, the Visigoths got that area, and then the Anglo-Saxons were mostly in power in Europe, and then the Franks were in power in Belgium and France and that area. Okay, and it continued to get broken up into different groups, but it was broken into all these different things because the empire was weak and could no longer keep these invading forces out. And then in Charlemagne, in the 770s came in, and he took over the whole area, and he was the king of the Franks, and him and his armies conquered most of Western Europe. They took over almost all of this area again and made one big empire. And when he did this, he was also not just taking over the people, but converting all the people that he could to Christianity. And he thought that Christianity was the way to bring all of his people together and strengthen them, because they'd all be fighting for the same thing. And so the Pope in 800 AD said that Charlemagne had done so much for Christianity that he was now known as the Holy Roman Emperor, which was really important because he's the first non-Latin person, the first non-Roman person to be called the Emperor of the Empire of Rome. Okay, and that happened in about 808 AD. And he really thought not only Christianity was important, but he also thought that law, so everyone knowing what they were supposed to do and being held accountable for it, and education was very important. So he set up the schools in the Roman Empire, in the Frankish Empire, where he brought in all the best scholars from around, and they came in and they taught classes, and people were encouraged to learn as much as possible. This slide is kind of split in two. It's about some raiders and some missionaries, which are very different people, but some of the raiders, the Vikings came in. They came in from Scandanavia. They started in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, okay, and they were kind of island hopping, as well as going to the coastal cities. They were really good on ships, and what they would do is they were kind of like pirates. They would raid all along the coast, and then they would come in and attack your town and take all your treasure and take whatever and go back to their homelands. But eventually they found a place that they liked. And so they started to civilize and settle down a little bit and take over some of these lands. And so one group of such people were the Magyars, and the Magyars were a group kind of like the Vikings, and they became Christian in the 1000s. So they they left, they became civilized, they became Christian, and they settled down. And when they settled down in Eastern Europe, they created the Kingdom of Hungary, which is still a country today. And so this kingdom was created by these raiders running around and eventually finding Christianity and settling down. Now, how was Christianity found by all these people? You can see on the bottom here, there's some stuff that's cut off a little bit, but just I think you can read it. Christianity was, most of the people that were pagans, most of the people that believed in many gods, they converted to Christianity, they switched over. So the people that weren't switching over were also monotheistic, but the polytheistic pagans did start to convert to Christianity. And so what ended up happening is these people were out there trying to spread Christianity as much as possible, and they were called monks and nuns. And the male religious people were monks, and they lived in monasteries, and they gave up everything. As you can see, this bottom picture is of monks and nuns. Okay, they gave up all their nice stuff, and they gave up all their material possessions and everything like that. And they lived in these monasteries, and their job was to copy Bibles. They made Bibles because there wasn't a printing press at this time. There was no way to print them, so they had to copy them by hand to be distributed around the continent. And so the other group of people were the nuns, and the nuns were the female religious people that did much of the same thing. Okay, and we know nuns still exist today, but both of them have or gave up all their material possessions and worldly connections and just stayed connected to God and gave themselves over completely to God. The government was set up in this time as feudalism. Feudalism was happening around there, and so feudalism works kind of like this. So there are 4 different classes of people, and they are the king, the lords, the knights, and the peasants. And the king is in charge of all the land. They're in charge of the entire thing. So they find a way to gain the money. They recruit the army. They figure all that out. They give the land to the lords. They get to decide who is in all these other different classes. And then the lords are the people who are in charge of small sections of that of the king's land. And so the king of, let's say America was a kingdom, the king would be in charge of all of America, and then he may have a lord who is in charge of each state. Okay, and so that lord would manage those territories for him and protect you, and their armies could come to you if you needed to fight a war or something like that. The knights were the people, the army, the really good soldiers that were able to protect the lords and the kings. Okay, and then the peasants worked the land. They did all of the work, and their food and everything fed everybody else in the kingdom. And so the way it would work is you would start out as a peasant unless you were born into a higher class, unless you were, one of the rich people's sons or daughters, then you could start in a higher class. But if you started as a peasant, then you would go out and you'd fight in wars, and if you were very, very good at it, you could eventually be made into a knight. And then if you did something heroic and amazing as a knight, then the king may give you land, and then once you became landed, once you were given land, you become a lord, and then your job as the lord was to protect the king, was to do all those different things. So you could move up through this society, but there were way more peasants than there were anybody or any other kind of people. Okay, way more normal people than there were warriors or managers or kings. The other thing that was happening at this time was manorialism, and that's more of the economy. And manorialism is that the lords and peasants depended on each other. So the lords needed the peasants to be able to make the food and make the products and do all that kind of stuff, to do all the work. But the peasants needed the lords to protect them. Okay, and so they needed that leader so that they could be protected by an army, because the lord could raise an army, whereas a peasant really can't do that. All right, then we'll talk about the Crusades. The Seljuk Turks came in, and they conquered the Byzantine Empire. They came from Central Asia and moved kind of all the way through the Middle East. And as they were going, they were converting people to Islam. When they got to the Middle East, they were converting many people to Islam, and they started to take control of Palestine. And Palestine, or Israel, as we know it too, was a holy land, and it was a holy land for a lot of different people. It was holy land for the Muslims, but it was also a Christian holy land. And so the Christians objected, and they hated that the Muslims were in control of this holy land. And so in 1095, Pope Urban got together as many militaries as he possibly can and soldiers, and he decided to put together an army. And he put together a huge army and sent them out on a war in these military expeditions to free the Holy Land. And so this army that was made up of all these other armies that may have been fighting each other before, but they were all united as Christians fighting against this threat, went down to free the Holy Land. And so the First Crusade, they took Jerusalem, okay? And there were a lot of reasons that these people went down. A lot of people went for their religion and to stand up for Christianity. Other people were trying to check out a new land and maybe get some stuff out of it. They also thought, well, maybe we'll get some fame and maybe we'll get some statues and maybe we can move up and be a lord if the knights went down there and fought and were brave. And so they had a lot of different reasons for it, but either way, they went down and the First Crusade took Jerusalem for the Christians. And then the Muslims were treated very poorly. I mean, executed, things stolen from them, just terrible, terrible things that the Crusaders were doing. And Saladin came in, a Muslim man, and with his men and his Turks, he took Jerusalem back. And then the further Crusades kind of went down there and they failed and fell apart because people just weren't in it for the right reasons. But what this did do is it caused these terrible tensions between Islam and Christianity that are long-lasting, that still exist today because of the things that were done back in that time. The Muslims were in Spain as well. They ruled Spain for in about 718 CE, so that is the same thing as AD. They ruled Spain, and when they were ruling Spain, they were very tolerant of other religions. They were fine with it. They said you can be Jewish, you can be Christian, but you can also convert. And a lot of people did choose to convert to Islam at that time. But at this time of relative peace, these Muslims were making huge advances in sciences and arts and architecture, art, literature, all these kind of things were blossoming in this area. But there were a group of Christians in the 1000s that didn't like the Muslims being in charge of them. And so this group in the north started the Reconquista, right? And that is some northern Christians started to fight back and take it back. The problem is these northern Christians were kind of in a bunch of different little chunks. And so a small army would fight against the Muslims and they couldn't win it, and another small army, another small army. But then two people decided to get together, Ferdinand and Isabella, and get married, right? And they were from two of the larger, I guess you'd say civilizations, villages, whatever, of the northern Christians, and they brought together they got married and they became the king and queen of Spain, and they brought together all of the northern Christians to fight. And they went down throughout Spain and took it back for the Christians, and the last city to fall was Granada in 1492. And so the Reconquista was complete at that point. Then the Christians went into something that is, it's kind of an embarrassing thing in the history, the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was simply a church court that was set up, and I don't know why my thing got lost here, but to punish other religions. Okay, I'll write religions in here. Okay, to punish other religions. And it was basically, you would get accused of being another religion, and if they decided that you were another religion, then they would burn you at the stake. They would kill you by burning you at the stake. And so Jews and Muslims were burned at the stake, but also this group, this Inquisition group, became really power hungry, and they started to use the Inquisition as a reason to kill these people and then take their land or their possessions. So they would take people in that might even be Christian, and they would say, okay, come in, we're accusing you of being Jewish. And then they would torture them until they admitted to being Jewish, and then they would burn them at the stake and take their stuff. So it was kind of really a nasty time, where it started out as kind of a religious ethnic cleansing, where they were trying to get rid of everybody who wasn't Christian, and it turned into just money and power grab by the people involved in the church. So the Crusades had many good effects as well, and this was a lot had to do with exposure to the new cultures that these people got and kind of learning new things. And what it did is, first off, it increased trade. Spices and fabrics were brought back from the Middle East area that they hadn't seen or didn't have before, and so those were now sold and new trade routes were set up. And most of these people used money, not just trade, which, you know, the money obviously makes it easier to trade and increases that flow of goods. The second thing that happened is there were two big things two big inventions that we finally got a hold of that helped us to explore the world a little more, and that was the magnetic compass. And the compass is just what you know as a compass: north, south, east, west. And what happens is, as you're holding it, the magnetism of the earth actually always has the needle pointing north. And so if you line it up so that the needle's pointing north, then you can tell which way you are going, just by the way that the compass is showing you. And so you can tell if you're going northwest, northeast, south, whatever. Okay, and that's how the magnetic compass works. And then also the astrolabe, which is pictured down on the bottom right here. The astrolabe, you line it up with the stars and you line it up with the horizon, and you can tell your exact location based on latitude and longitude on the Earth at any time. And so those things obviously helped us to move around and explore the Earth a little more. Gunpowder and paper were brought from China by the Muslims and brought in, and so we started to see cannons being used and guns and things like that. A lot of gunpowder, and then paper to write things on, and then last of all, the Muslims passed on a lot of their scientific and mathematic knowledge, which they were very, very advanced in, to the Europeans. The other thing the Muslims did is they respected the Greek and Roman knowledge, and so they brought a lot of that too. They wrote a lot of that down and kept that moving forward. As the feudal era started to go down a little bit, the cities started to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there was a rise of cities. And the reason we were able to have more cities is because farming got a lot better. People started to drain swamps and clear forests and make more farmland. And they also invented something called the horse collar, where you could plow, you could hook your plow onto horses, and they could pull the plow through the land, which would be much faster than a human trying to figure that out and do it themselves. And so that was much faster to do the farming, as well as being able to do more farming. And the technology started to develop, and they were both military and civilian technologies that made it easier for people to live inside of cities. Things like clocks to know what time it is, and eyeglasses to see better, and upright windmills to make power. Plate armor, this big armor that a lot of arrows couldn't go through, and cannons and all kinds of stuff like that. Okay, and at the same time, commerce started to happen, and so there was trade, lots of trade, especially out of Venice and other northern Italy cities like Florence and Genoa and Naples. And it was trade was happening, but also banking was happening, and so there was ways to get loans and pay interest for normal people, and so normal people could get this money and become richer and become what the next thing is, which is a middle class. So instead of just being this low class and everybody that is a higher class was born into it, the middle class was born. And so there are all kinds of merchants and guilds, and these guilds are groups of people with common livelihoods where you did the same type of thing, and they would get together and protect themselves from unfair business practices, protect themselves from the king doing something wrong, because they could do things like strikes and stuff like that. And so kind of like labor unions a little bit, okay? And they were still lower than the nobles, but it was this middle class that wasn't quite as bad as the peasants. And so these large permanent cities started to be developed, but these large permanent cities had some issues. They were dirty, they were noisy, they were crowded. There was just a lot of people stuck together in a small piece of land. And so the William the Conqueror invaded France, and so he went in to try and take over most of Western Europe, was kind of his plan. He was the Duke of Normandy, and he thought that he was the heir to the England throne. So he thought that to the English throne, he was going to be the next one. However, the kingdom was given to Harold, and Harold was the king of the Anglo-Saxon people. But William the Conqueror thought that he should actually have it. And so he went in and he invaded England. And when he invaded England from France, where he was, he defeated the Anglo-Saxon people in the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And after he did this and took over, he treated them really poorly. He treated them as inferiors. He said, you're not good people, you're not as good a people at all. But eventually he married, and his people married Anglo-Saxon people, and they all got married together, and they kind of became one person. So there really isn't today a distinction between Normans and Anglo-Saxons. They're all kind of white people as we see it, or English people. So at the same time he was taking over, and all these other kings were struggling to keep their power as much as possible, and time's going by, and eventually the King John of England abused his power, okay, and he was using it poorly and whatever. And so the people said, we are going to rebel against you, we're going to fight against you unless you sign the Magna Carta. And what the Magna Carta did, of course John had to do it, a gun to his head, he had to sign it, but what it did is it took away a lot of the king's power, and it gave a lot of the power to Parliament, and Parliament's kind of like our Congress, okay? And so it limited the king's power, and it led to democracy because it came to Parliament, and then Parliament started to institute common law where we all have the same law and they're all built by the people instead of built by the kings. The fighting between England and France did not stop there. It actually turned into and evolved into, in the 1330s, the 100 Years' War. And the 100 Years' War happened when France tried to take over some English territory that was actually in France. So it's in southwest France, but the English had taken it over before, and so they tried to take it over. And this started in 1337. And went all the way to 1453. So it was actually 116 years that this 100 Years' War was happening. And while it was happening, England took a lot of territory from France. They took a big chunk of northern France because the French had kind of lost that battle in the southwest part of France. And so France was kind of falling apart, and they were starting to lose this war, and they really needed some spark. And so in 1428, Joan of Arc came up to the king, and she was a 17-year-old peasant girl. Remember, peasant, the lowest class people. And she went to the king and said, I saw God. I had a vision. I talked to God, and God told me that I should lead the French army into battle at Orleans. Okay, and so she did end up leading them into battle because the French king was so stuck doing that, and so, or was out of options, I guess, and so she led them into victory at Orleans. The French army actually did win that battle. Now, a year later, she was captured by the English, and she was seen as a witch, and so they actually burned her to death because they thought she was a witch who was talking to demons instead of talking to God. However, as you'll see, moving forward, this military technology started to destroy the old things. It started to destroy knights and castles. So we had things like cannons that can knock over these big walls that people were hiding behind, and we had things like long bows, which the English started out, and these were these really, really tall bows and arrows, and they would make a lot more force. And so when they let go of the arrow could punch through the plate armor that the knights had. And so now you're this very slow thing because you have so much armor, because before arrows were just bouncing off of you, and now the arrows can punch through. Now it doesn't make sense to have that kind of armor and to have knights anymore. And so this kind of spelled the end of it. But the French won the war, and they took over the rest of France, and England had to go back to England. And so in 1453 that happened, and it took the two areas took two different paths. The French took on more monarchy, where the king had more power, and the English took on where the parliament had more power, and the king and queen got actually less power than before. And so medieval society started to fall apart, and it started off with famines. About 15% of the population died in the winter of 1317 because, for a bunch of different reasons, the crops did not grow well for many years before that, and so people were starving to death. About 15% of the entire population of Europe died during this one terrible winter because the bad weather meant there was no crops, and now there were too many people to support with the little bit of crops that they had. The other thing that happened that really hurt was the Black Death. And the Black Death was a plague. It was the bubonic plague, and there was an outbreak. And what the bubonic plague would cause is these extreme pain and swelling in all of your lymph nodes for a couple of days, and these things would get really, really big, and they would start to pop and bleed, and you would bleed out of every hole in your body. I mean, you'd be sweating blood, you'd have it coming out of your eyes and your ears and stuff like that, and it was just horrible and terribly painful. And then many of the people that got it would die as well, most of them. Okay, and the thing about the Black Death is rich people died, poor people died. Didn't matter if you were the king or if you were a peasant, it didn't matter at all. And so about 1/3 of the total population of Europe, about 25 million people, died from the Black Death, from the bubonic plague, which we'll read a little bit more about in a actually learn. But this caused society to completely change. Okay, it caused where everybody's dying, they realize everybody's the same, and so the society started to change, and these peasants wanted more money, and they wanted to be have the same amount of power as anybody else. They wanted to be paid. They didn't want to just give food. There were all these different things. And then that military technology started to happen, which got rid of castles, and knights aren't going to protect you anymore. So what's the point of lords and kings and all that kind of stuff? And so it kind of completely destroyed feudalism as a government type and manorialism as an economic type.